on being the first and the last. To begin at the beginning means to begin at the end. I was number 7, the last of 7 children, but everybody knows that 7 is a primary number. Primary meaning first. My entrance into the world was my first performance. I took a peek from my mother's womb and decided, yes, the world is a stage and I shall dance upon it. I shall dance in the delight of my difference, knowing that I was not the first. That first, there was my grandmother, whose Samsonite hands washed and scrubbed and ironed and served, and was the last to sit at the welcome table to break bread. But first, we had to pray for those who were still in last place because they knew their place. Her friends, other domestics who were the first up in the morning to cross the tracks that divided white from black, and the last to get home to attend to their own children. My first lesson on Marxist political economy and Gramscian hegemony happened at my grandmother's side, at the Smiths for whom she worked. Our things and the Smiths' things looked the same to the undiscerning eye of a young queer boy who did not have the cultural capital or taste, says Bourdieu, to appreciate those distinctions. But my first London fog windbreaker, a hand-me-down from one of the Smiths' children, I wore with pride and sartorially embodied the contradictions of the haves and the have-nots, because knowledge is power. And I knew, despite where it came from, that jacket would keep me warm and knowledgeable about the weapons of the weak and the arts of resistance as I headed toward first grade. They lost the memo. They lost the memo, the one that stated segregation was over in 1955. 18 years later, someone found it, stuck to the last page of an old Bible in a drawer of the former mayor's desk. So, in 1973 in Hickory, North Carolina, my first grade class was the first of my generation to experience an integrated classroom. First grade. The last sight of racial equality and the first sight of race as embodied performance. Indeed, a colored contradiction. Our crayon box had several colors in it. I preferred carnation pink. But our world was literally one of black and white. The innocence of our tight eyes inoculated us to the epidermal warfare being waged all around us. Color was just that, color. Signifiers, semiotics, and symbols be damned. Highlights magazine and Dick and Jane primers reflected the black and white images on their black and white pages that attached no meaning for us beyond an opportunity to add more vibrant color to their pages with our crayons. Even back then, in the first grade, at least this queer little colored boy knew that everything needed a splash of color, and especially some carnation pink. In this monochromatic schema of black and white, of course our teacher's name was Mrs. White. Bunny White, to be exact. Mrs. White was the only person I knew who was called by the same name as a pet. Like her bright-eyed and bushy-tailed new students, Mrs. White was also naive about how integration would press to the limits of what she considered a liberal consciousness. In an article she published some 23 years after I was in her first grade class, she says, quote, "Patrick was one of 4 minority children in my class. I was soon to learn that young people don't see color in their relationships. What a delightful discovery," end quote. One day in Mrs. White's class, Bryant, one of the other minority children, and I wanted to play a record. Bryant and I began to play tug of war with the record, and I got half and he got half. Seeing what we had done, Mrs. White ran over to us, snatched the pieces of the record out of our hands and yelled, "You two little colored boys!" Bryant and I had not seen color in our relationship. But Mrs. White's own whiteness came into sharp focus as Bryant began to cry, and I stood there searching Mrs. White's angry white face for answers to questions that she could not answer and that she would later deny were asked. So I went to the person who had all the answers, my mother. "Why did Mrs. White call me colored?" To which my mother replied, "Because you are." Versed neither in Foucault nor Butler, my mother stood on the mountaintop and delivered a postmodern lecture on social constructionism, strategic essentialism, performance as epistemology, and of course, Black religious theology a la Jesse Jackson. On that day, I came into racial knowledge at the crossroads of performance and performativity. Pace D. Soyini Madison, I felt and saw the world differently. I spoke differently and more. The recognition did not go unrecognized. Memory marks the mind's eye in ways that tell us the lies we need to live out the contradictions of our lives. Mrs. White doesn't recall the record incident and was shocked to read about it in my first book in the last chapter of Appropriating Blackness. My recollection of the first grade incident tarnished her image of the little colored boy she remembered as, quote, "a beautiful child, happy and gregarious, who had a strong interest in music," end quote. Mrs. White nurtured my interest in music by paying for piano lessons and buying me a clarinet for band. This is a part of the story where our memories converge. But the halo effect of the happy memories is dimmed, colored, if you will, by the uglier side of race knowledge that sustains Mrs. White's willful denial of what I call her benevolent racism, and my own hateful embrace of my simultaneously remarkable and unremarkable blackness. I acquired a reading and coloring strategy that little colored children must learn as a matter of survival, how to read between the lines and color outside them. In her inscription to me in the book that contains an essay about her 40 years in education, Mrs. White writes, quote, "I am proud of you and proud to know I touched your life at a formative age. Best wishes and love, your white mother." Bunny White, first grade teacher, 1973 to 1974. And the colored contradictions continue. While my quotidian sight of blackness was the first grade, my queerness circled and swirled around me like bees to honey until I finally fell headfirst into its centripetal force. While writing and performing about others' queerness, I came to fully inhabit my own. From my first article on snap culture, to my latest book and performance with T, the holy trinity, race, class, sexuality, bundled together through embodied performance, has been my life's work, with my life story imbricated and implicated in the telos of its telling, the interplay of memory, experience, identity, and embodiment and agency. And for that, I say thank you. I thank my grandmother for her last words, "Do good, child, do good." I thank my mother for my first word, dance. I thank my first grade teacher for racial knowledge. I thank my last great teacher for giving me the tools to name it and claim it. I thank my first students for teaching me how to teach. I thank my current students for teaching me how to learn anew. I am grateful to be the first African American born in Hickory, North Carolina, to receive a PhD, and to be the first African American to receive tenure and chair the Department of Performance Studies. But I am most grateful for the ancestral scholars and activists like Carlos Montezuma, the first Native American to receive an MD from Northwestern, for being the first so that I would not be the last. Thank you.
As you know, Patrick, this is a tangible symbol of the esteem in which we hold you, the affection we have for you, and our gratitude for the many contributions you've made to our community. I'm delighted to put this medal on you.
For the first, but not the last time.
Yes. Congratulations, Patrick.